Yeah, it isn't red, it isn't blue, but you know what? The Dust Bowl is here for you.
What? Dust Bowl?
Hey, so Max and I were watching this Ken Burns documentary series about the Dust Bowl, and Max came up with an ingenious analogy for what we're going through at the moment, and that is the Dust Bowl of money.
Yeah, the Dust Bowl of money. So this is a fascinating documentary by Ken Burns. And it talks about how the Great Plains, the great grasslands of America, starting in the 1920s or so, or a little bit before then, were, agricultural to death, over agriculturalized in this mad rush of speculation. And it's a man-made ecological disaster, the worst America's ever suffered. It lasted 10 years.
The disasters of good intentions and the structure of good intentions from the government, how they can create catastrophes. Of course, when we say the Dust Bowl of money, we're looking at the money supply system and the fiat money system. But back then in the Dust Bowl, what had happened is quite a few mistakes had been made in the lead up to the Dust Bowl, a man-made ecological disaster. And there was a drought, and there was really high temperatures that came for a few years, and those are obviously natural. But the man-made elements to it were the Homestead Act, which gave 160 acres for anybody who went out there. It drew out a lot of amateur farmers, so they didn't know actually how to plant the crops properly and tend to the soil. Also World War I, a man-made disaster, and that led to increase in wheat prices. So people planted way more than the soil could possibly sustain. And then the Great Depression happened, and in order to make up for their losses, they acted like Silicon Valley and just printed a whole bunch. They were losing money on every bushel, but they figured they'd make it up on volume. And so there were a few elements like that man-made decisions that led to ultimate disaster, where the topsoil, which was quite thin, was totally depleted. And one more thing is, when they did that Homestead Act, the Southern Plains in particular is where the Dust Bowl hit, is that area was having unusual freak wet weather for a few years running, and everybody assumed that there was actually a policy that if you plant, then the rains will come. That they believed superstitiously at that point that it was actually agriculture that attracted the rain.
Yeah, there was a whole mad rush. First it was the beef barons. They tried to raise cattle, didn't work. Then the next thing came the wheat farmers, and the grasslands developed over millions of years of evolution, because that's the most appropriate kind of agriculture, not agriculture, but, ecosystem for the high winds that are going on there. And of course, that was the huge, for the buffalo, millions of heads of buffalo who used to be there, of course, before the Western expansion of the U.S. government. And so they turned over the soil, and they exposed it to the winds. And they did it, the rate at which wheat was cultivated suddenly over this stretch of acreage, literally millions of acres were suddenly just turned over, and wheat was planted. And the description of the catastrophe of these dust storms, which were literally mountains of dirt that would swoop into these towns and drop 3 feet of dirt into the town.
This high.
Yeah.
It was just 200 miles wide storms, 10,000 feet high, just hundreds of millions of tons of dust from 1931 until 1939. And that was the other remarkable thing that kind of reminds me of like 2008 to now, right? Is just like storm after storm, black blizzards, as they were called, just kept coming and kept coming and kept coming, destroying all the crops, starving their livestock, like nonstop. And they just sat there like waiting for something to change.
Yeah. So it's a man-made disaster, and it's something, I was never taught this in school. The Dust Bowl, maybe you spent an hour at most talking about it, that there was a problem, you never really dug into it. But as far as being a man-made disaster and the Dust Bowl of money, so the current situation that we're experiencing, I just saw some prices. Iron ore and steel skyrocketing, wood skyrocketing, metal skyrocketing, copper, etc., food, oil, energy, all these things. We're in an inflationary boomlet. The policymakers are saying it's transitory. Now they're tempering their language. They're saying, well, maybe it's not so transitory. The prospect of real breakout inflation is happening here. Why? The Dust Bowl of money, the hurricane of money that has been pumped into this economy for decades. We didn't notice it at first because all those jobs are shipped to China. So that was a mitigating factor to any inflation. But now, since China topped up and you've got wage parity, all that hurricane of money is now just kicking up real inflation, real price inflation. And you see this obviously in the altcoin market. That's a direct altcoin market makes fiat money look even stupider than it usually does, because people are selling that stupid fiat money to buy altcoins, which is amazingly bad comment on fiat money. It's really embarrassing for fiat money. It's also obviously driving a lot of other things to speculative bubbles.
Yeah, I mean, when a lot of what you're seeing in the money system, like there was a moment in Dust Bowl where they talk about this guy who was half Cherokee or Navajo, and obviously his ancestor had lived there in the Southern Plains for thousands of years, and he was just watching these white men tear up the entirety of the plains, and it's just like saying, what's going to happen there, right? Like, it was so obvious. Now that Homestead Act, as I said, it brought out all of these amateurs, right? Like a lot of people came from Europe because there was no new land available in Europe. So they came here, didn't know how to farm, but arrived and in a different environment and started planting wheat. But in finance and money and our current economy, I point out that the Glass-Steagall and the Commodities Futures Modernization Act have delivered the same sort of thing to the financial system, right? So the Glass-Steagall got rid of the wall between the bank deposits and speculative side of the bank business. And then the Commodities Futures Modernization Act enabled basically gambling, right? Derivatives, the explosion in derivatives, but it drew in a lot of these amateurs, right? These the system is so fragile because, like, all those packaged derivatives that were then basically sold to pension funds and amateurs, right? Like, it was put in people who don't understand the risk, just like those people, settling the Great Plains had no idea of the risk of what they were actually doing.
No, and I thought it was what I thought was really interesting also was that the depression hit in the early 1930 after the crash, and the farmers out in the plains were thinking it wouldn't impact them, that they were insulated from it. But of course, all the sell-off and all the securities on Wall Street and back east did eventually eat into commodities as well, because people just needed to sell anything to raise cash. So then price of wheat went from like $2 a bushel to 15 cents a bushel. So you had an ecological disaster and a financial disaster combining. And, it just created this enormous, incredible, unbelievable hardship for a decade. And it's man-made. It could be avoidable. So I think one of the points is that this situation we have ourselves in now, where people are really stressed out about how the economy is flipping over like the Titanic, and how all kinds of things are happening, including inflation plus GDP loss, which would be stagflation. Remember, this is all man-made. This was by our own volition. We willfully walked into this buzzsaw thinking, like the farmers, that it wouldn't affect somehow us. And now it's just becoming this pervasive dust storm of money. This pervasive storm is just seeping into every nook and cranny. And people are, similarly, they are gobsmacked. They're like, what is going on? And yet it was just so predictable.
Yeah, it was totally predictable and totally chaotic. And they just sat there with black blizzard after black blizzard arriving. And after a few years, there were actual real human life costs. Like people died, a lot of children died and elderly died from pneumonia. They called it dust pneumonia. Their lungs were just filled with all of this, with like fine dust particles from in the tons, right? And so here are some headlines from this week that can be, compared to what happened in the Dust Bowl. And this is from the Dust Bowl of Money, however. Yellen's remarks spark confusion and brief panic. So Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, insisted that she is not concerned about the risks of economic overheating hours after her earlier comments about inflation caused a brief panic on Wall Street and invited fresh scrutiny about the White House's position. She had talked of higher inflation and that rates might need to rise, of course, because she still has her, her central bank hat on, but she's the Treasury Secretary now, and caused some panic. So, all those panics that were when the system is so distorted and price signals are so manipulated in order to, make everybody happy. When you're telling these homesteaders, like, go out there and like, whatever you want to do, just go do it. And you see them building up to this catastrophe. And you do see that policymakers back in Washington were realizing that disaster was coming. And there was actually a really good agriculturist from North Carolina who helped fix the situation out in the Great Plains, but he was warning ahead of time. Like they saw that this was coming and what would happen. The same thing here is like, you're not allowed to warn because then you might cause a stampede.
Right. Interesting. The government did save the country from being desertification. Right, there was a real risk that the Dust Bowl would just continue to spread. Remember, a couple of the storms actually blew dust into New York and Chicago, all the way back east. That's how incredible big these dust storms were. And there was a real risk that that entire desertification that was taking place in the Plain State was going to just spread. And but the U.S. government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal policies went in there and reversed the situation. And, it's a fascinating discussion about the role of government and how the government, particularly in an audience of anarcho-capitalists and libertarians, et cetera, it's an interesting conversation to have. But what I wanted to say was that the gosh darn it, and that slipped my mind.
Right. Well, I do have something else to add to this because remember the other story that he covered was the suitcase farmer.
Yeah.
So these were like city folk, on eastern parts of, say, Oklahoma or something. So they would get on a train or drive out there or something with their suitcase, and they were buying 1 acre parcels of land. So this was at, in the late 29, in the 28, 29, especially, like, because wheat prices were so high because of World War I had knocked out so much production in Europe. And so you had these guys who were even worse than amateur farmers. They knew nothing about it. And they were just like, their farming practices were even worse than the amateurs of the Homestead Act. So they came out there, just planted the seeds, didn't tend to the crops, and just went back into the city. And then, so they like packed in even more and were like huge speculative bubble that was being pushed into there and created oversupply of the wheat when sending the prices plummeting when the depression hit. But in terms of the money dust bowl. Yeah. We haven't had enough coffee. Actually, I think I've had too much coffee today, but
never enough.
So, looking at, you mentioned lumber prices.
Yeah.
They soared to $1,610. This is 1,000 board foot CME monthly change. Look at that hyperbolic move, right?
It's a hyperbolic move. Yeah.
This is, are basically responding to the Homestead Act of ever lowering interest rates and ever more fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus. So you have it's a natural response to it, right? The same thing happened with the wheat, right? Like why wheat prices went up to $2 is that there was a supply shortage, but the government had intervened and given them this higher price in order to increase supply. They wanted to encourage those homestead actors to go out there and plant more wheat in order to capture market share. Yeah. So they were fixing that price of $2, and then the depression hit. So lumber prices are just like out of control. But in terms of the mindset, WolfStreet.com says that buyers all along the chain of what's going on in property right now are willing to pay those prices. And it shows that there is a massive shift in the mindset. What would have caused a buyer strike in past years is now causing a buyer's frenzy. So that was like, remember the frenzy leading up to the Great Depression, and then the Great Depression hits. So
price signal is destroyed in the housing market. So he's saying ordinarily those high prices would deter purchases until the market stabled. But because there's panic buying due to the prospect of a collapsing currency, the fiat U.S. dollar, there's panic buying and this crack up boom. I think, you can say we're in the crack up boom stage, the Minsky crack up boom stage, where people are panic buying assets. And the talk of inflation being transitory is just, it's not, no one's believing it. And once you lose confidence, it's really almost impossible to reverse. And we're just like 2 or 3 weeks away from there being declared a hyperbolic inflationary catastrophe, a dust bowl of money that was completely avoidable had there been some sane policies. But we walked right into this, as we've been talking about. The Bitcoin at $50,000, $60,000 a coin was telegraphing. That was the price signal. Because the market was free to trade, unlike gold and silver, that's not free to trade. There's no good price discovery, unlike the bond market without good price discovery, right? Because the Fed buys all the bonds. Stock market, you have stock buybacks with all the free money, not good price discovery. Only Bitcoin is free to trade and free to communicate and tell you that your currency, the dollar, is in a hyperinflationary collapse against Bitcoin. That's what it's saying. And apparently it was right.
Yeah, and this dust bowl of money, a few things. So first of all, like this Great Depression, we're still in the parabolic crack up boom part. And yet Biden and previous administrations have basically already done all the FDR programs, right? They've done huge packages of stimulus in the crack up boom times. So just like building up these massive 200-mile wide, black blizzards that are tearing through the economy in a way that, people are just like they did back then. They took a lot of photos and were like amazed at these black blizzards like sweeping through their homes and destroying all that they built. And and in a very passive way, right? They're just like sitting there waiting for it to end and praying and hoping that there's going to be rain or whatever, because, that's all they had at that time. And then here it's just like, Bitcoin fixes it, right? Something eventually fixed the Dust Bowl situation, and that was like better agricultural practices.
Yeah, the government imposed agricultural standards, including buying back millions and millions of acres that they let without any plowing whatsoever. So it's
still like that, yeah.
Grasslands could return, and the government in this case. This is an argument that I'm surprised people don't use this argument more often when the capitalists are battling the anti-capitalists. The anti-capitalists, I'm surprised they don't bring up the Dust Bowl more often, because this is an example of unfettered capitalism, which was leading to the entire destruction of the United States of America. Had the government not interceded and imposed and in some cases, the equivalent of martial law. Remember, they were saying that the farmers were not going to be continuing to do what they were doing. And that was imposed by the farmers. The farmers themselves are begging for that kind of restriction. And there was no choice.
I'll take the other side of that argument and say the Homestead Act gave that land for free to people whatever their qualifications. So it attracted people who were total amateurs and didn't know the soil, didn't understand agricultural practices. And the other thing is they set that price of wheat, which encouraged more and more wheat planting. As there were people making a lot of money at that time. Like some of the earliest homesteaders that had come out in the 1905, 07, 10, that area, they were making big bucks. And especially because they were first into that scheme, but also the government was paying them a big amount to plant this wheat. And so it invited all of these, the price was wrong. It shouldn't have been sold for $2.
It's a new game show. The price is wrong. Starring Monty Hall. Come on down. You're wrong. What do you think? Who's right, Max or Stacy? Leave your comments in the comments section. Hit subscribe. Hit like. Hit this button. Hit that button.
But it's it was definitely the incentives were wrong. And the incentives in Bitcoin are always right? Like it harnesses that greed and turns it into altruism. The incentives given by the government harnessed the greed into a catastrophe.
Right. Well, Bitcoin is self-regulating.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, and outside of Bitcoin, you have the market, and then you have regulators, and they're not in sync. Rarely in sync. There's this tension, and you have exactly what we're talking about here, versus Bitcoin, where it's self-regulating. It's perfect in all aspects. So that's the huge reveal.
Yeah, and we tend towards idiocracy, right? I mean, basically the situation in the Dust Bowl was idiocracy. And fortunately, there was that guy, I think his name was like Grinnell or something like that. He was from North Carolina, and he had the answer to the situation. And there was also the, New Deal programs of basically they employed thousands and thousands of bankrupt farmers to go plant the grasslands.
Yeah, there was a great discussion about make work. Jobs versus just sending cash. Because we have a situation now where 35% of the income of Americans right now is from the government. It's direct payments, cash payments. And the decision back then in the 30s under FDR was to create make work programs. So put men to work doing stuff. And many times it appeared as though they were just standing around with a shovel. But the benefit of that was there was a sense of dignity that for men that they were actually doing something. Versus today, where if you just send money out, what happens is a lot of times the male population becomes indignant. They become like you're disrespecting them in a huge way. And we see that being acted out. We see all kinds of problems on that front.
We see a rise in violence. We see opioid overdoses. But, we're just pointing out that this, in terms of the Dust Bowl of money, like perhaps there are loads of good intentions, but they ultimately create catastrophes because the price is wrong and the bad incentives. So even if you are trying to create a good incentive. But with that, I think it's a good time to
The road to perdition is paved with good intentions.
Exactly. And it's time now to turn to our amazing guest because he has a fantastic piece out about the petrodollar and talking about bad incentives and, perhaps guided by good intent in the beginning, but the fact is it's now led to a similar catastrophe, one could say. And that's Alex Gladstein.
Oh, okay. Let's go to that interview. Exactly. Let's hit the button.
I guess my price signaling to you is wrong.
The price was wrong. Do I win? What do I win?
All right. Time now to turn to Alex Gladstein. We're super excited to have him back. He is the Chief Strategy Officer at Human Rights Foundation, but he's out with a fantastic piece called Uncovering the Hidden Costs of the Petrodollar. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
So, this is a topic near and dear to our heart. Max and I, our very first content ever created for International News Al Jazeera English was about the petrodollar. So the costs of the petrodollar are actually not really all that hidden. And yet they are. Like, it's weird that it's not spoken about publicly. Anybody could see the costs and the wars, as you mentioned in your article, the 90,000 overdoses last year in America. Those are deaths of despair caused by basically the U.S. being the reserve currency, having the Triffin Dilemma, having to have a huge trade deficit. But anyone at Bloomberg or FT or, the financial news will kind of call it a conspiracy theory that this is even happening.
Right.
So go into what is the petrodollar and how do you know it's not just a conspiracy theory?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting the way you put it. And that is indeed what I initially thought when I looked at this. When you Google the petrodollar, you are met with a lot of, let's call it non-mainstream writing by authors who do not get the bylines in The Economist or the Financial Times, right? So naturally, I'm a very skeptical person. It took me several years to grok Bitcoin. I was very skeptical at first. So anytime I encounter something that contrasts with my worldviews, I'm a little skeptical. So I'm like, okay, is there a reason why everybody writing about the petrodollar, can't get a byline at a major media organization? But then you start to dig in a little deeper, and I think it really helped when I realized that the actual implications are actually quite well known, as you mentioned, and quite well covered in macroeconomic thought by investors today. So I think probably the biggest boost in terms of thinking now about the petrodollar system has been given by people like Luke Gromen and Lynn Alden, who have huge mainstream audiences. And they're to them, it's obvious. When they talk about this system, they state it as a matter of fact, like it is. But for a lot of people, they think this idea that, the US is somehow, its currency is tied to oil. They view this with a lot of skepticism. So for me, the work was in doing this piece, doing pretty much a full month of research and talking to folks, interviews, and trying to grasp the issue. And I found it really interesting because there's a really wide variety of political thought done on the petrodollar. So you have a wide range of people from different ideological backgrounds who have analyzed it in this critical way. One of the best critics, of course, on this subject is the very left-wing economist, Michael Hudson, who I'm sure you're familiar with. He wrote Super Imperialism in the early 70s, 6 months after the US went off the gold standard. And his whole theory has been about what he calls the treasury bill standard, right? Which is the way he basically frames what I would call the petrodollar standard. Obviously, for me, the petrodollar really begins in 1974 with military agreements with Saudi Arabia, which had sort of just become the sort of dominant player in oil markets due to its newly found sort of swing status. It was able to kind of control the price and flow of oil. But even before 1974, people like Michael Hudson had correctly identified that the U.S. Treasury was becoming the new world reserve currency as we were moving off of gold. What I've analyzed is that by tying it to the export of oil, it really boosted the ability of the Treasury to be that currency for many decades and gave it a lot of strength. And U.S. foreign policy has protected that for decades. I now believe this is eroding. The power of the U.S. government to protect the system is eroding. And as an American, I'm conflicted about that. Obviously, I'm a huge beneficiary of the petrodollar system, and I believe that there are very brutal regimes that are obviously going to benefit in certain ways from the unwinding of it. So for me, it's a nuanced and complicated issue. But I really felt like writing this article because I do believe that very few people think about the negative externalities of the existing system. And I really get sick and tired of people focusing on the negative externalities of Bitcoin without thinking about what is the alternative? What is Bitcoin trying to oppose, right? So I just wanted to dive into that for folks and lay out, what are the costs of our system? We all know its benefits, of course, but when we think about wars and oil and dictators and the environment and the financialization of the world, these are not often discussed.
Right. And, what I know about it is that oil business is very capital intensive. There's always this relationship with banks to lend to the oil business, the energy business. And it created super large banks, that became very dominant in the economy. The banking industry went from being 3 or 4% of GDP. Now, if you include the whole way things have been commodified and financialized, it's closer to 45%. And in the derivatives market, oil is the most actively traded commodity in the world. And for every barrel of oil, there are 60,000 paper barrels of oil in the derivative market. So this is really, when we talk about the petrodollar, it's on as the base layer of a Ponzi scheme called fiat money. And that is grown since the 1970s into the quadrillions. A lot of people don't understand that the derivative markets are in the quadrillions now. And it has a lot to do with the cancerous like growth of the banking industry because of this relationship with the Saudis in particular, who said, look, we'll buy every piece of paper you print if you take our oil in this kind of unholy bargain. But the reason this has all come up, though, right, is because a lot of people are criticizing Bitcoin for its energy use. And I think that prompted a lot of people to say, hey, wait a minute. Let's look at this energy industry for a second, because Bitcoin potentially kills two birds with one stone. Not only does it kill fiat money, but it kills the petrodollar, and it kills this whole unholy alliance that's going on globally with the Saudis and the dollar and all these things. Isn't that kind of the impetus of all this right now, Alex?
That's certainly what got me thinking about it, was people saying, well, wait a second, what are the negative externalities of the dollar? And again, I guess just to go into the history briefly, in 1971, we go off the gold standard. Nixon closes the window as primarily a result of debt from Vietnam, war debt, essentially. We'd never run a war off so much credit before in our history. Previous wars had been fought with a significant level of taxation. That was not the case for Vietnam, and it really broke our ability to sustain the Bretton Woods system. Many other countries obviously saw this coming, the French, the British. And in researching this, I thought it was fascinating to learn, I did not notice that the French actually sent a battleship to New York City in August 1971 to collect their gold, and the British asked for basically about $3 billion of gold to be moved from Fort Knox to New York to prepare for withdrawal. So governments around the world were anticipating a dollar devaluation. They wanted to get their gold out before then. So that's when Nixon closed the window. The dollar devalued by 10%. And to make matters worse for the U.S., in 1973, because we supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War, the OPEC, the Arab oil, mainly Arab-led oil exporters who controlled about 80% of the world's oil at the time, decided to embargo the U.S. and could, essentially quadruple the price of oil. So we had this huge economic crisis in the United States and worldwide. And Nixon and Kissinger basically sent their new Treasury Secretary, William Simon. They basically tasked him with solving this issue. And throughout the summer of '74, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia came to DC. Nixon went to Saudi Arabia. And by the end of that year, we had this deal ironed out, a lot of which was written down and classified on the Saudis' request, because they did not want bad PR from dealing with the Americans, because that would make them not popular in the Arab world at the time, because they didn't want to be seen as like cooperating with an Israeli ally, right? So they wanted this secret. We did keep it secret. Those documents have now been declassified as of the 90s, so you can actually read them. But essentially, we gave the Saudis preferential rates on treasuries. Okay, so this idea of petrodollar recycling was that as the Saudis and the other OPEC nations were racking up this absolutely enormous amount of dollar-denominated income from sale of oil around the world. I mean, again, the barrel of oil had gone from $2 to $12 in a matter of years. So they had such an enormous amount of wealth, and they didn't know what to do with it, right? So under American guidance, they started basically depositing it in Eurodollar bank accounts. This is what Max just mentioned, the growth of this kind of financial system. And those were oftentimes invested into US treasuries. They were often loaned out to the third world, to developing markets throughout the 70s and 80s. And this was the system of petrodollar recycling. Now, a lot of the critics today say that they will, of course, admit this, of course, happened. I mean, no one can argue about the facts. The critics of the petrodollar theory basically say that the significance of the tie to oil waned over those decades, and that today it doesn't really matter anymore. And the reason why people choose to use the US Treasury as the reserve currency is because there's no other game in town, and that it's, the most safe and secure, right? That's kind of the idea. But I guess when I'm looking at in the data and in world history is that the US has really prioritized dollar primacy, even today. I mean, Joe Biden's team publicly, this is not a conspiracy. If you read the media carefully, you'll see that the Biden administration is very intense about dollar primacy, right? We still have 60% of the world's foreign exchange reserves, in our currency. So it's clearly a big American foreign policy goal to keep this going. And, if you look at the history of our foreign policy, once we defeated the Soviet Union, and again, as an American, I think you can make a fair case. The petrodollar really helped to defeat the Soviet Union. I mean, we could print oil. They had to dig it out of the ground. Okay, so why didn't we have another Bretton Woods after 1989? Like, why didn't we come together with the world and try to figure out a new system? I don't know, but we decided to keep the unipolar moment going, right? And we continued to defend dollar primacy. And as a student basically, I was born in 1986. I went to high school during 9/11, and I remember debating on stage at high school in 2003 whether or not we should go to war in Iraq. And I remember having to take the pro side. And this is a crazy moment in my life, but I remember standing on stage in front of hundreds of kids saying we should invade this country. And it's like kind of crazy to me. And I went to school up for IR, international relations. I studied the Iraq war, and I studied the neocons, and I studied why we went to war. And the crazy part is, and this is just frustrating to me, we never looked at the financial side of it. We never looked at the currency side of it. And on reflection, decades later, to me, it seems quite clear that one of the main reasons we went to war in Iraq was to protect the petrodollar standard. I mean, none of the official reasons make any sense, and we all know that. And the crazy part is, mainstream media, historians and experts on the Iraq war, they call it a war, a war in search of a reason. No one knows. Like, there's no consensus on why we went to war. There's a lot of different reasons, of course, but this one remains kind of hidden from the public's view, I think, to this day. Now, I didn't include other countries in that article, as I'm sure you noticed, because I didn't feel like I could defend it as strongly. I really feel like the invasion of Iraq can very much be tied to defending the petrodollar standard. As far as events that started to happen after 2010, I'm not as sure. For example, Libya, I'm not quite as sure. I understand the evidence, but I feel like, look, in 2014, China stopped buying treasuries completely, right? So the world's been dishoarding treasuries since then. I feel like the war in Iraq bought us another decade, essentially, is my theory here, that it gave the petrodollar more years. It was at a time when the euro was a real challenger to the dollar. Like, if you of course both were there, but like the mainstream media was like talking about how the euro was a big challenger to the dollar. And if Saddam was going to be pushing the petrodollar forward with his 5% of the world's oil, well, that's an issue. So I really do believe it was like American action to protect our primacy, protect our system that we have here, where we can get other countries to finance our debt for social programs and for war. And I feel like that is now, the hourglass is running out. Like, and I'm not sure it's as effective at explaining stuff in the last decade or so, is I guess what I'm saying. But certainly through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, I think the petrodollar very much guided American foreign policy.
So Max and I we first started podcasting in 2003. And we were covering this. We covered Saddam Hussein converting selling oil in euros. We were covering that live. We covered this whole thing. In Europe, it was pretty big news. That was widely covered, that basically no blood for oil sort of thing. That was the way it was presented in much of the left press over there. But I want to, explain those last 10 years, because I do see the petrodollar, and I know you quoted, and I hadn't read it, but recently, about Joe Biden saying, he wants this primacy of the dollar. But, in the lead up to Iraq, what you saw, and as you mentioned, Bush was already planning an invasion of Iraq before 9/11. So what you saw from those neocons, of course, is the policy for a new American century. And what they laid out there, why they needed to invade Iraq, was because of China, because they didn't want China to get those oil fields, because America didn't, as you mentioned in your article as well, it's not like we import a lot of oil from Iraq or Saudi Arabia or anything, but they didn't want China to be able to compete with us. So that's still ongoing. Obviously, that's a big part of the story today in your piece as well, because of the China basically have stopped recycling their dollars from about 2013 when they introduced the Belt and Road Initiative. But I want to go to that moment where you're talking about, when we went off the gold standard in 1971, and then we went on to the petro standard, and now the petrodollar, and now we're at today. The one thing that's common throughout all of it is that Bretton Woods and the Triffin Dilemma. So it was predicted, the reason why we went off the gold standard is because of the Triffin Dilemma. And the reason why we're at where we're at today is the Triffin Dilemma. And that's the domestic cost, the domestic population. The 90,000 overdoses last year, 70,000 the year before. Like, these are epic, huge numbers, more than the entire 20 years that we spent throughout that time period, 1955 to 75 in Vietnam. So, explain what the Triffin Dilemma is and how we see it today.
Yeah, well, I mean, essentially, you have a situation where traditionally, if you're a country that's not holding the world reserve currency and not issuing it, if your debt grows too high, your currency starts to get devalued, and you start to pursue more of like an export-led strategy. And then your balance of payments issue gets addressed, and it's like a balancing factor that happens naturally in the world to countries as they coexist alongside each other. But when you have one country as the essentially issuer of the world's reserve currency, that balancing effect does not come into play, right? And other countries continue to invest in our debt, right, via a very different demand than they would invest in other countries' debt. Because it's kind of like the hardest money of all the debt, right? People want American debt more than other countries' debt, is what you've seen over the last several decades, sparked, I would argue, by the petrodollar system, right? So this kind of treasury bill standard, as opposed to the gold standard, prevents the US from having any balancing. So we continue to run up massive deficits. I mean, if you look at some of these ratios, debt to GDP, things like that, I mean, it is, triple, quadruple what it was in the 70s. So there were people worried about it back then. And, it's gotten so much more exacerbated since. So the dilemma is essentially that the currency has to be devalued. But the other nations, they don't necessarily want that to happen, because if that happens, then America becomes competitive again with its exports. And that's not great for them. So everybody's kind of stuck in this, like, that meme with like Spider-Man, he's like, they're all pointing at each other. It's kind of weird. It's like, the US is benefiting massively, of course, but other countries are kind of stuck in it in a way. And, China's starting to back out of it, right? But precariously so, right? Because they still have a huge amount of our debt, right? I mean, they've been dishoarding, but not like, they don't want to crash the market, right? So, to me, what the cost, as I think some macro folks have put out there, is that instead of chipping away at our gold holdings, we've just been chipping away at our manufacturing base, right? So the cost for us as a country of upholding this is that we no longer export competitively, and that has led to massive inequality, stagnation of wages, obviously despair, as you've pointed out, among a lot of lower middle class people, and to the enrichment of people on the coasts, essentially coastal elites who deal with defense, finances, healthcare, technology. We've done amazingly well as a nation in these industries, and all these things account for a way higher percentage of our GDP than they used to. So I think even just financial sector generally is 20% of GDP now. It used to be 10%. So I think, the costs that we bear as a result of the exorbitant privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency is that we have to develop in this kind of twisted way, where it's kind of like the more wealthy and more privileged continue to benefit at the expense of everyone else. And then other nations are kind of forced to keep the system going. And it's very kind of depressing to think about. I don't know.
I kind of feel, though, the actions of especially the Biden administration, it feels like, I mean, he came into power just when we went off the gold standard. That's when he first came into office. And it's the 50th anniversary of 1971 going off the gold standard this summer. So it feels kind of like they like, there's a sense that they know it's at the end. These are the end days of it, and it's about to change. We saw the IMF recently say we need a new Bretton Woods. The amount of money printing going on is extraordinary, and I mean almost unnecessary, because incomes are up 21% in the past year over previous years. It's just remarkable. And the fact that Joe Biden was recently saying we're going to go 50% renewables by 2030, that's abandoning the petrodollar.
Yeah, I mean, and Triffin specifically said in the 60s, like, that he didn't see another way for us to, and this was as people were realizing that post-gold, we might go this way, where dollar debt would be the reserve currency, that there'd be no way to sustain the system without the US just running up more and more and more and more debt, right? And again, we've laid out the costs of what the system has done. But I thought that's very interesting that, look, a lot of critics obviously have, including you all, have been staring at this for decades. And what's interesting to me was to look at the impact this has had on emerging markets as well, or what used to be called like third world countries, right? In a lot of this literature, when you're reading these books, terminology has changed, but like, it's about self-sufficiency versus dependency, really. I mean, there's this whole thing, dependency theory, right? And like, all these countries, are they going to be agriculturally, financially, technologically, politically sovereign, or are they going to be dependent on the US, right? And this system has really forced them in many ways, a lot of them at least, to be dependent on us. And especially because the IMF and the World Bank like kind of act in concert. They are interested in upholding this system. So learning about that was very interesting for me, as well as like the energy piece. Like, a lot of these nations wanted nuclear energy in the 70s after they saw the oil shock, right? They were like, we don't want to have to pay for that. We want to be independent. And the World Bank and the IMF and the US were very discouraging of that, to put it mildly. If you look at countries like Brazil and Pakistan, especially, like, there were strong discouragement of national leaders who wanted to bring their nation into energy independence. So I think that the agricultural energy side of it is really interesting, as of course, as well as the financial side of it. And, again, to bring us to today, I think even 20 years ago, again, like, Michael Hudson was saying that, he said in 2002, no serious alternative is being proposed to the American-centered financial system and the debt deflation its monetarist policies are imposing on debtor economies outside the US. And, the euro was essentially was the solution, was like, hey, let's make a bipolar financial world. And the US fought that off. So who's going to stick their neck out? Satoshi Nakamoto. I mean, that's really, I think, the deep thing here. People get tied up in Bitcoin and its price and all the altcoins and all this stuff. But if you dig down deep enough, really what Bitcoin is a competitor to the petrodollar system and a replacement in the lineage of gold to the treasury bill standard to the Bitcoin standard. And that's what is most fascinating to me.
Right. Okay. So we had an interesting intersection of all these different thoughts very recently at the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting. Charlie Munger made a comment, and this is part and parcel of some other announcements they made. The Berkshire Hathaway, of course, Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, they're going to increase their oil investments in a big way, and they made a big speech about how hydrocarbons and oil is the future. And then about Bitcoin, he said, quote, "I hate Bitcoin's success. It's disgusting and contrary to the interests of civilization." Right? So there's a big clash of ideals here, the legacy system versus the new system, Bitcoin versus the old system. I take it you heard those comments, and it's interesting that he believes that it's contrary to the interests of civilization. That's quite a broad stroke he's making there, Charlie Munger, Alex.
Yeah, and what you're pointing out is this kind of like alliance between the establishment financial system and the establishment energy system. And I think this is one of the main things that Bitcoin seeks to disrupt, actually. And it's maybe not even something that was predicted early on in the years of Bitcoin, or maybe that Satoshi couldn't even imagine. But really, you're positing an alternative to, again, fossil fuel industry and the world being reliant on the dollar as a reserve currency, because you could potentially have this neutral asset that could potentially run very significantly on renewable energy, and taking the role of the dollar, which again right now is linked very much to oil. And I wanted to use another quote from Hudson here. Again, a couple decades ago, he says, "Today, it would be necessary for Europe and Asia to design an artificial, politically created alternative to the dollar as an international store of value. This promises to be the crux of international political tensions for the next generation." And it's funny because I think a lot of political scientists and a lot of geopolitical thinkers and macro investors have agreed, and they know that this is an issue, and they saw the rise of the euro, and they saw America fight it back in different ways. And they're thinking about the SDR, right? This special drawing right, which is based on the failed idea of the Bancourt that Keynes had during Bretton Woods, that we could have this internationally managed kind of unit of account, right? But no one really believes in that. No one really believes that's going to work. I mean, no country's going to give up its power in that way. So we're kind of stuck here, and we may have indeed remained stuck for a long time in this like really vicious cycle, were it not for Bitcoin. And it's just funny because a lot of what people, especially when you all were probably covering, in the run up to the Iraq War, this like this sort of frenzied, behavior that this gives the U.S. government, that really I think is embarrassing as an American. It doesn't need to be that way. And I guess this is the area I'm really interested to talk to you all about, was the idea of being, patriotism, America. For me, I think America would be better, and we could potentially be much more dynamic as a nation in a Bitcoin standard world where we didn't have to support dictators in the Middle East. I mean, the amount of support we've given to Saudi Arabia, I mean, they torture female political prisoners. They destroyed Yemen. They funded Wahhabist thought and terrorism all around the world for decades. And yet we continue to prop them up. We refuse to release names. We refuse to investigate them for 9/11. I mean, 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi. Bin Laden was Saudi. And yet we continue to cover them up because of this petrodollar system. So if we didn't have to do stuff like that, we didn't have to support fossil fuel industry, and if we didn't have to go to war to protect this thing, and if we didn't have to sacrifice our middle and lower classes on the altar of this thing, I mean, I think we could be a much better country. That's. I mean, it sounds utopian, but I'm sure you all agree at some level.
Totally agree. First of all, Max and I lived in Europe for a very long time. We saw firsthand with our own eyes, like how the middle class lives there so well compared to the middle and lower middle classes here. And so I think it would happen in America too, once you need the consent of the people, because we are almost like a Saudi nation in that the elite don't need the ordinary person. We're a disposable population pretty much for the vast majority. I think that's the worst thing. And that's why I bring up that number of, it looks like they don't have the confirmed numbers from last year, but it does look like 90,000 overdoses last year, 70,000 the year before. Those are wartime numbers, and our number, the mortality rate is increasing. It should be something that we all want to, there needs to be an answer. And that answer is adopting a Bitcoin standard, going off this petrodollar, which is killing people. It's literally killing tens of thousands of Americans.
And you're now seeing the rise of a new FUD for Bitcoin. Of course, we have the Bitcoin FUD dice, and we need to add a new angle. We need to add a new FUD piece, and that's that Bitcoin is unpatriotic. So a lot of folks are now saying this. And here's the thing, and this is just my belief. You think about the ideals, not the outcomes, but the ideals that America was founded on. If you read the Declaration of Independence, obviously a badass document. And you think about some of the things that do still define us, like we do have open capital markets, more or less. We do have free speech, more or less, again, compared to other nations. We do have property rights. Bitcoin reverberates with all these things, clearly. Free trade, free speech, property rights. It is the highest possible order of those things. And I think that it does benefit more open societies versus authoritarian ones. So this is how I kind of square this with what I do, because as you guys know, I'm focused on dictators and trying to help people live under dictatorship. And for a lot of people, that can be difficult to consider once they realize deep down that like the petrodollar system is really, really also very malicious. So how do you square these two things? So for me, morally, it's like, I think that actually we'd be better off because we would benefit vis-a-vis the Chinese Communist Party or the Saudis. Like if oil was all of a sudden like less inflated as an asset in terms of its price, if it no longer was a store of value and was just an industrial, just for its industrial purposes valued, then Putin and the Saudis and these dictators, I mean, they wouldn't be able to subsidize what they were able to do, and if you think about the way that the Bitcoin standard would work, I mean, it just kind of forces people to comply with a more open system, with a more free system. And I think that's going to be very bad news for authoritarian leaders. And it'll be like a good reform mechanism for our own leaders who, as you've pointed out, are propping up this really sick system. So I think we would benefit from it. Everybody will go through a serious reform. The world will look very different in 50 years than today. But I think that Americans can benefit, and we could be more equal, I think, in certain ways, and not in a way of, I don't believe in equality of outcome, but I think in terms of equality of opportunity, in terms of government policy helping everybody and not just the 1%, I think it can help us, and I think it hurts tyrants. And that's kind of my perspective on that.
Right. Well, on the energy use and comparing it to Bitcoin, and what we're saying is, if the energy that goes into mining Bitcoin is creating the hardest money ever known and promotes individual sovereignty and echoes the ideals of the America's founding, then that's a really good use of energy. And so we shouldn't really decry the fact that energy is being used for this way. And compared to the current energy usage. You can't compare the two, you see. This is what happens in the media, is they get conflated. They say, well, Bitcoin uses as much energy as New York City, right? Like there's all these comparisons that are not appropriate. What you're articulating there is there's a quality of energy use. There's energy used to sustain the petrodollar. Then there's energy used to create the Bitcoin standard. One is as patriotic as mom and apple pie. The other is not only politically nightmarish, but it's also ecologically a horror show.
Yeah, I think this is really important, is thinking about let's say they call it the ecological side of this. One system is wreaking havoc on the world in a variety of ways, primarily the protection and defense of the fossil fuel industry against nuclear. I mean, if you think about where nuclear energy should be, where renewables could be, I mean, they've really been attacked over the decades, especially outside of the US. So if you think about the costs, let's call it environmentally, of the petrodollar system, they're really enormous. I mean, even just the US military is like the single largest consumer of oil, has a carbon footprint of a mid-sized nation, right? Just on its own. Whereas with Bitcoin, I mean, I think what's interesting is a lot of the critics don't understand a couple things here. And let's talk about Bill Maher for a second. Just the research that he quoted was from this 2018 paper. And I think there's a couple really alarming things about it that people should know. First of all, that paper assumes that Bitcoin will do 300 billion transactions a year. It assumes, if you read the paper, this is the paper that Bill Maher cited for his whole audience, was a paper that assumed that Bitcoin itself, the main chain, would process almost all the world's daily financial transactions. So today, Bitcoin does like 300 million a year, okay? And guess what, Bill Maher? It won't do that many. Like the main chain of Bitcoin is not going to do that many more than 7 to 10 transactions a second. What's happening is everybody else's activity on Bitcoin is going to happen on second layers. I'm a human rights activist. Of course, I hope they are non-custodial. I hope we do stuff like Lightning. A lot of it will be done on custodians. But the point is, almost all of the activity on Bitcoin in 20 years will not be happening on the main chain. It'll be happening on second layers. So this idea that like this system is going to scale linearly with transactions, it's completely false. The second thing is they don't take into account the fact that it could become more reliant on renewable energy. And if you look at any chart of solar, for example, or any of these technologies, they become so much cheaper over time. Clearly, they're going to continue to compete with fossil fuels in a massive way. And the third thing that they miss is that sorry, give me a second. I forgot the third thing.
No, let me jump in here for a second. So
yeah, go ahead, Max. Go ahead. Yeah.
Ironically, these 2 points of FUD, as is often the case, it's a matter of projection, right? Because number one, Bitcoin is actually green. It's probably the greenest industry you're going to find, and it's skewing toward finding renewables and trapped energy. And you take the mining to the energy. You in Africa, for example, as you're aware, I'm sure, the diesel energy is a problem because energy doesn't transport well. You have to recreate the diesel engines over and over again, and it creates a lot of problems. Whereas with Bitcoin, it's local. All you need is a local stream or river or what have you, or hydro, and you've got your energy. So that eliminates the transportation problem. So it's actually a green industry, and it's actually patriotic if you believe in the fundamentals of the founding documents of the United States in terms of sovereignty, sound money, and these other types of things. So those who call it unpatriotic and not green are projecting the petrodollar, and they're projecting the unholy alliance that America has with, like, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and just I remembered the final thing, of course, is that none of these critics assume that mining technology will become more efficient, and it's becoming a lot more efficient. So again, just to recap, we have a lack of understanding how the system scales, and a lot of activity in the future, again, will be on things like Lightning that don't take any energy, essentially have no energy footprint. You have a increasing share of renewables, and you have more efficiency in the technology. And these are all things that contribute to this argument, which is, as Max says, is pointing towards Bitcoin as being this, basically thing that's treasonous for Americans. And this is, I think, really something that needs to be objected to. I understand that Bitcoin doesn't need our help, and that Bitcoin will complete its mission just fine on its own. But I do care about this because it prevents otherwise reasonable people who may benefit from this thing from learning about it and using it, right? So I don't care about defending Bitcoin for Bitcoin's sake. It's not necessary. It can defend itself far better than any of us, right? But I do care about opening people's eyes who need it. And that's why I do my work with trying to talk to activists around the world about this. And guess what? They're way more woke about the petrodollar and the U.S. financial system than a lot of the folks in Silicon Valley and folks like Buffett and Munger and people in Wall Street. I mean, they understand the double standard here that, to modernize their nations have had to prioritize stacking dollars by either export-led economy or by buying them in FX markets or whatever, as opposed to domestic investment. So a lot of these emerging market countries have been focusing on paying back their dollar debt or buying oil to industrialize in dollars, as opposed to investing in healthcare and education and stuff internally. And that's very rarely mentioned. This is a massive, massive thing. And I suppose one reason why the petrodollar system isn't talked about a lot is that some of its effects are subtle over time, right? Because after the 70s, you can argue that, again, as its critics do, that, hey, maybe it mattered in the beginning, but now it's just that America's the behemoth and everybody trusts it, and why wouldn't you want dollars? But there's just so much evidence to suggest that America has protected the petrodollar with military might and all these other things, and that it has cared deeply about dollar primacy. But again, now we're at the crossroads here. And a lot of people have written the obituary too early of the petrodollar. So I'm not going to write the obituary today. I mean, the U.S. still controls 60% of the world's foreign exchange reserves. 40% of the world's debt is still issued in dollars. Something like 90% of all the trade. So we're not there yet, but the system is clearly shaky. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, the fact that China has, first of all, they mentioned the Triffin Dilemma in 2008 during the financial crisis. Since then, they have started the Belt and Road Initiative, which is kind of similar. You could argue like the Marshall Plan, maybe from a different intent behind it, but nevertheless, they're deploying soft power and those dollars around the world and gaining power on the world stage. And that's a fact, and you could see it. And they're kicking our ass on high tech in many areas. And so that's a fact as well. And you've got to address that. In terms of Bill Maher and Charlie Munger and these sort of people, you know, we in America right now, we've been going through a crisis for the last few years in terms of some domestic issues about white privilege, and that's a truth. But there's also the exorbitant privilege on top of it. And these people are going to have to give up the exorbitant privilege. We on the coast, we in these sort of media class and stuff like that, we've benefited enormously from the US dollar and the financialization of the economy. But there are vast swathes of the country that have been deeply harmed, and we could see that. That's a fact. Now, you know, the question I have for you, though, is like, does the Bill Maher person, do they have to come to this conclusion? Do they have to see, like we're seeing in the rest of the domestic economy, that they're going to say, okay, I have enormous privilege from the Cantillon effect, from the US dollar as reserve standard, and I'm going to have to give up some of that, or I'm going to have to share some of that privilege. I'm going to have to change. We're going to have to say goodbye to the petrodollar.
Yeah. So here's the interesting part. And it's just, I don't think it's like something we've never seen this before, in that as much as, yes, you have people who are extremely privileged, myself included, obviously. And then you have scholars who agree that America is privileged. And like, normally we'd have to like have some solution that would require compromise and altruism and empathy. And guess what? Those things are really hard to achieve in such a Machiavellian world, right? The thing is, we don't need to worry about that. I mean, Bitcoin will convince everybody in the end simply because of price, right? So it's not, it will become more valuable over time in fiat terms. And the Bill Maher types will end up getting into it, not because of any intellectual or empathetic reason or shame over their privilege. They will get into it out of self-interest. And that is the beautiful mechanism at work here that Satoshi created, which again, I haven't seen anything like it before, but they will all get involved one way or another. So that's a relief from my point of view, that we don't have, if they want to wake up to the world that's around them, to the water that they're swimming in, and realize the toll that the system has taken on the world and how it has misshapen, I would say, our society in really grotesque ways, that's okay. I'd encourage them to do that. And that's why we're all sitting here talking about this and airing this and promoting this, because we hope more people can understand now. But at the end of the day, I think Bitcoin is the thing that fixes the privilege. It is the thing that fixes the debate over, do we go to an SDR? How do we fix this? The irony is that Bitcoin is the fix. And that's the thing that all these brilliant, more left-wing critics of the petrodollar system don't get, right? So they're like really on the money, so brilliant about, like, read. I mean, again, I quoted David Graeber quite a bit in the piece. Like, he has this extraordinary section in his book about the petrodollar system and about the war machine, and it's really good. But he wasn't into Bitcoin. So that's the interesting thing, is they don't actually see the tool when it has arrived, right?
Max sat with David Graeber and Russell Brand, tried to talk them into Bitcoin. They didn't get it. So.
Michael Hudson. With Bitcoin, you pay the price you deserve.
Yeah, and so will countries, right? And I do think that that's interesting, because again, I think inevitably we're going to trend in a direction where America will do well. I mean, look, a majority of the world's infrastructure, developers, holdings, however you want to define it. And we know that none of these things necessarily controls Bitcoin, but America's very well positioned. Let's just put it that way.
So
versus
in summary,
other countries.
So China wants to grow their economy, and that means they have to get some energy, and energy is priced in dollars.
Yes.
So to get those dollars, they've got to export stuff.
Yeah.
And those exports go to the U.S. And
yes.
The U.S., by the way, is also the banks that are creating this reserve currency of treasury bills. And these banks are lobbying Washington to allow the jobs to go to China so that China has something to export back to us so that we can send them the dollars that allows them to buy the energy.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is the beautiful nature of the Treasury bill standard and the petrodollar recycling system, is that these countries have to export goods to us to earn dollars.
Right. And
that
so
gives
we
America
willfully
cheap
send
goods.
them our jobs so that they have the ability to accumulate dollars in exchange for those exported goods.
To buy oil.
Because they got to buy energy, because energy is only priced in dollars.
Right. Now, as of 2019, that was the case. But as I point out at the end of my piece, we're now starting to see that start to decline. Like, there's a lot more in the last couple of years trading between whether it's Russia and Europe or Russia and China or China and the Belt and Road countries in different currencies, whether they be rubles, euros, yuan. It's still small as a percentage of the overall, but it's growing. Like, the US dollar used to be, I believe, like 80% of reserve currency holdings. Now it's down to 60 and it continues to fall. So these things continue to fall. They will continue to fall over time. And China has this new strategy, I believe, which it's going to basically try and do, which is to copy the recycling that we've done. Except what they're going to do is now they are the world's largest importer of oil, right? They're the world's largest demander and consumer of energy. So they're going to force that flow to be denominated in yuan, right? So all these oil countries exporting oil to China will all of a sudden have yuan instead of dollars. And when they used to take the dollars and invest them back into the US in our debt to keep our machine going, they're now going to take those yuan and sell them back to China for technology and surveillance stuff. So that's the new recycling that we're going to start to see. And again, as a human rights activist, I'm not that excited about that, but I mean, that is just something we need to keep our eyes open for and observe that other countries are going to start to realize, or have realized for decades, the privilege of the recycling system, and they're going to try and set it up for themselves, right? I mean, the Europeans have said for years, like, how ridiculous it is that when they trade with an African nation or a Middle Eastern nation, they have to do it in dollars. It's absurd. So naturally, this is going to disintegrate. So the only question is, like, where do we go from here, right? And again, mainstream thinkers, political scientists, they really have these four scenarios. They say somehow, by other means, the U.S. Hegemony could be sustained. They say we could fall into this kind of bipolar kind of situation with Europe or China. Essentially, we could go to this multilateral scenario with an SDR and the BIS, or we could all kind of break off into little pieces and be more decentralized and rivalrous and disconnected. What they don't realize is there's a fifth option. There's the Bitcoin standard, and that would bring us all together, I think. And I sound like a hippie, but it really would connect us.
So to put this into context for the middle class who might be fearful of loss of the system in the petrodollar, if the world went from a U.S. dollar reserve standard as it is now in the petrodollar, and it went to a world where there's 5 or 6 competing currencies, then the U.S. would, in their own interest, want to be able to get some of that currency, and the only way they could get it is through export, and the only way they could get that is by developing their manufacturing base. And that's your middle class. So that ipso facto, get rid of the dollar as world reserve currency, break the petrodollar standard, and jobs return to America, and middle class benefits, and that's what they're missing.
And there's one other national security consideration for the US, which I do believe the Biden administration understands, and so did Trump, was that, and the COVID pandemic caught us with our pants down here in America on this, but supply chains. I mean, all this important stuff that we need for our society is built by other people. And that was great for a long time, but you know what? It's not so great anymore. So whether it's medical supply chains, or technological supply chains, defense supply chains, whatever, you're going to see an effort at a subsidized rate, by the way, to bring that stuff back here. But ultimately, yes, I agree with you 100%, Max. It would be healthy for us to start to export again and to have that, not just subsidized interest, but actual economic desire as a nation to export again.
And the people who get in the way are the bankers on Wall Street who get the seigniorage. That's the block. Those are the lobbyists. They've got the most lobbyists. They're the ones who finance the campaigns. They create the fake bipartisan or partisan fights going on because they're an entrenched oligopolist.
But I'll jump in there because it is interesting that we have a very old president who's been around for 50 years since this, and he was, in the pocket of the credit card companies and stuff. But he's so old, he doesn't have a political future to fight for. Like, he could be the one to end it. He could be like the Nixon, going to China. This is that moment where he could do that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you'd be like going to cyberspace instead of China, right? But I think that this is a moment, right? This is starting to happen. The system is starting to unravel, and we can argue. We'll be arguing for years about the influence of the petrodollar, right? And I'm here. I wanted to write this so people could understand essentially the basics of the petrodollar allegory and system. And of course, there are going to be critics who dispute. I love to argue with them and debate with them because I think it's a healthy dialogue to have. And I think that even they'd admit that clearly the US gets massive privilege from having the ability to issue the world's not just reserve currency, but numeraire for finance and for energy. And again, we can't forget that one of the side effects of this whole system has been these like extremely low interest rates on US debt over the decades that have just gone down and down and down. And like normally, again, that wouldn't necessarily happen. We'd have to like raise those rates to lure people in to buy our stuff, but we don't have to do that. Like those rates could be super low. And of course, as you all know, that benefits, the asset holders, right? So not necessarily just Wall Street, generally, but specifically people who hold assets that have been inflated due to this. And again, left-wing folks like Hudson really described this well. That has benefited not just the people who own stocks and real estate, but also people who kind of make healthcare and education, right? So all four of those things have exploded in value versus the dollar over the last 20 years. And that is the toll of our system. That is the cost of our system, and it's not discussed enough.
Right. Well, I'm glad you discussed it with us here because I think it's time to end this whole, conflict, this emerging partisan conflict, not only in the United States, but in Europe, the end of that sort of Cantillon effect that is a part and parcel of this fiat system. And I think it's time to go on the Bitcoin standard. I think it'll be a relentlessly optimistic, positive world.
And individuals will have had the ability to participate on equal footing with governments. And that's a really exciting thought. I mean, it's not so easy for like the average citizen in India or Brazil to get a US treasury. Do you know what I mean? It's not so easy, or to even get a greenback sometimes. But now anyone with internet access can get the same world reserve currency as the CCP and as Washington, DC. And that's interesting.
Yeah, as Nick Bhatia said to us here, that basically we all become Medicis. Like Medici was equals to the city-state governments at the time in the Vatican.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
The piece no matter is what called, Uncovering the Hidden Cost of the Petrodollar. Alex Gladstein, it's rocking crypto Twitter and economists all over the world who are reading this agog, saying, my God, this is the Rosetta Stone we've been waiting for. Everyone should read it.
I'm glad people enjoy it. Thank you all so much.
Thanks a lot.
A lot of fun.
Thanks,
right,
Alex.
So I'm sure everybody loves that interview with Alex Gladstein. Really thought-provoking. And it's fun to see somebody younger like go through a similar, thing, discover stuff that we were talking about 10 years ago, like in terms of our own arrival into the Bitcoin space.
Right. Recontextualizing this information through a Bitcoin sensibility in a very succinct and well-written way. The essay gets 3 gold stars in my book.
Right. And Max I think we should have a Max Kaiser's glasses index. Show them your bucket of.
No, I'm not. That's a secret.
Okay.
I don't want to show it.
He has some big bucket down there.
Yeah, that's Plucky guards. That's Plucky's main job is guarding my sunglass stash.
So this Dust Bowl of money meets the petrodollar, and I think that's a good time to throw to this little commercial break from our sponsor, the Sun Exchange, where you could monetize sunshine, right? That's a good way to, a decentralized solution to this top-down petrodollar system. Wherever we could spread decentralization and individual empowerment and sovereignty around the world is the way to go. Here's the ad break.
Yeah, let's do it.
Sun Exchange is the world's first peer-to-peer solar leasing platform. Earn Bitcoin solar power in communities in Africa and be part of the new world economy. Visit thesunexchange.com/orange pill and start monetizing sunshine today.
Right. So, like, I brought up that point, speaking of, Biden being like FDR, everybody's like comparing him to FDR, but he's doing these FDR programs while, stock markets are all-time highs, incomes are up 20-30%.
Yeah.
But he's also, like, I've commented on this a few times in the past few weeks, is that he wants to go 50% renewable by 2030. So 9 years from now, which of course means he's saying the petrodollar is dead.
Yeah. Yeah, he is. Yeah. I mean, if he doesn't, he's in for a rude awakening because it will kill the petrodollar. And that's the only really thing supporting the dollar is the petrodollar mechanism, as Alex was saying there. So if Biden's going to go renewables or in this huge renewable project, it's going to undermine the dollar. I don't think they fully understand that.
I'm pretty sure they must, because if the IMF is also saying we need a new Bretton Woods, like there seems to be at higher levels. They also know about the Triffin Dilemma. They all understand, like, you can't continue to have 70, 80, 90,000 Americans overdose every year.
But
you can't just.
It seems like the whole voting now is virtue signaling, and in anticipation of these midterm elections, they're thinking, what can we say to get the social justice warriors to vote for us again? Let's talk about renewables, right? And we already know that they've disassociated the consequences from the actions, and they don't see any connection between their actions and any consequences, because they see themselves as above any consequential of their actions. So, but I hear you. I mean, it would be remarkable if they didn't understand the Triffin Dilemma, if they didn't understand the petrodollar. I mean, it would be remarkable. I agree with you. That would be astounding.
Thucydides' trap. And of course, the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, that was during a time, the turmoil, like it's interesting how the natural world and society, like every human's interaction, like it starts to reflect what's going on all over the place. So that was the collapse of the British Empire and the rise of the American Empire. And now we have a kind of, a collapse of American power. Certainly, at the end of World War II, we were 40% of global GDP. Now we're 20% or 15% if you counted on PPP. But in terms of the similarities to the last time this happened, the opioid overdoses, I think, are like those, what they called Okies, even though it wasn't actually mostly Okies. It was like people, hundreds of thousands of people across America, getting in their cars and traveling to California, looking for jobs and work and hope. And the opioid overdoses is kind of like that element to the parallel to what happened during the Dust Bowl. So, and driven by the Dust Bowl of money, I believe, like the Dust Bowl of money, the fact that we have the petrodollar, the fact that the US dollar is a reserve currency necessitates the basically them becoming expendable. Like their jobs are expendable, and there is no manufacturing or wealth creation or dignity that can happen.
Opiate addicts are the Okies of this cycle.
Yes.
And you say, like, okay, Biden's putting in these programs that are like the New Deal, but they're coming at market tops. There's something very suspect about that. And number two, think about the fact that for the past 30 years, there's been a New Deal for Wall Street called quantitative easing, right? That's been the constant bailout of Wall Street for 30 years, going back to the crash of in 1987, when it had the first major Wall Street bailout. That's the New Deal for bankers. Then long-term capital management crashed, and there was another New Deal for bankers. Then there was the bond crash in 1993. There was a dot-com crash in 2001. There's a subprime crash in 2008. And each one of these resulted in a New Deal for bankers, where they were relieved of any regulatory obligations and flooded with all this free money.
And causing a deeper, darker Dust Bowl of money.
Darker.
The black blizzard of all of their fraud. Like none of the fraud stops. None of the fraud stops.
No.
The derivatives bubble gets bigger and bigger. The debt load gets bigger. And they keep harvesting the same thing. Like the bad harvest, the bad agricultural practices are the bad financial practices of today. So the financialization and securitization of everything has led to the situation we find ourselves in. Even like what the property market, you have loads and loads of speculators from all over the world actually buying up those single family homes now. That got down to that level, and they're packaging them up into, securities, because, renting them out and packaging that up into securities and blah, blah, blah. So it's causing the same consequences, the man-made dust bowl of money.
Right. Just like the farmers did the same bad farming techniques for 10 years. And the results were the same: catastrophic weather and dust bowl. The bankers on Wall Street, they keep getting these handouts and they keep repackaging the same things over and over again with catastrophic results. And so if the government doesn't step in, and it hasn't, then the Mr. Market will.
Bitcoin fixes this.
Bitcoin was going to come in and fix all this garbage up.
Right. So remember, if you want to stack sats, and you should be wanting to stack sats because of this dust bowl of money is going to deliver a black blizzard of financial catastrophe soon.
Yep.
Like on top of, you think those, remember, the worst of the black blizzards was April 14th, 1935. That was 4 years after black blizzard after black blizzard after dust storm after dust storm. So they were hitting nonstop, and they thought it can't get any worse. Just hang on one more year, it can't get any worse. And it got worse, right? So this is the same situation we're going to be in, because, that huge wall of dust coming. Yeah. That's the financial system now, right? With all these derivatives, all these petrodollars, and it's will fall on you. So you want to stack some sats, and if you want to do it, go to swanbitcoin.com/orange pill. You get $10 when you sign up using our affiliate link. Here's a representation of Swan. Come down to Swan. Swan is like that Swan is like that North Carolinian who rescued the system with just a brilliant idea, right?
Come on down to Swan. And the price is wrong when it comes to fiat money. You want Bitcoin money where the price is always right. Come on down to Swan. Get your $10 free Bitcoin with your registration at Swan. Come on down. Get your free Bitcoin today.
Right. Max, I want to jump in there and say that's the truth. Is the price is always right in a free market, and it's always wrong in a rigged market and a manipulated market.
Yep.
There are no price signals that are allowed to be real.
That's right.
And that's why Janet Yellen caused chaos by speaking any truth, right? You're not allowed to speak truth.
What I was going to say about that Janet Yellen thing is I really feel like I'm in a hospice now. Do you know, if you're in a hospice, they'll be talking amongst each other and saying, we should really start the palliative care now.
Palliative care
now, because the patient is close to dead. And then the patient will be like, what? I'm sorry, what did you just say? And then the doctor will say, oh, no, we were talking about somebody else. You're fine. You're doing great. Don't worry about a thing. Right? That's Janet Yellen. She kind of spoke. She thought she was speaking to other adults in the room. And then she was like, oh, wait a minute. I forgot. We're the patient's, half conscious. We got a senile president. We can't actually use, we don't want to scare them.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's what I said. You denied it, but I said it earlier. And that is that, when the IMF, which the U.S. runs essentially, and the IMF says we need a new Bretton Woods, Janet Yellen is probably the one that told them to do this, to prepare for it. This is not, that's you're saying palliative care doctor. She's the one that told them, get ready. We're going to pull the plug in a few months.
Yeah.
So this is them preparing, but we are out of time.
Oh yeah. We're out of time.
You could tell because Max usually wakes up in the last few moments.
I'm up and I'm ready to go. Oh, the game's over. Oh shoot. I was going to score.
Right. And finally, again, our sponsor, thesunexchange.com/orange pillow. Go visit it.
We should get Sunglasses Hut to sponsor the show.
No, we're gonna.
I'm always, with their sunglasses.
Well, we'll get a better.
I'm going to approach them.
We'll get a Bitcoin.
I'm going to reach out, and then I can do a reach around.